Welcome to Scrolling to Death. Today I'm joined by the Executive Director of Fairplay, Josh Golin. Hi, Josh.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to interview Dr. Susan Lin recently, who is the former Executive Director and founder of Fairplay. That conversation was fascinating and coming soon. But can you start by telling listeners about Fairplay? What is your team focused on?
Sure. So Fair Play, as if you talk to Susan, you know this, was founded really about concerns about advertising to children and how that affects their sense of self, their behaviors, their relationships. And I think about, maybe 10 years ago, we really started to recognize that the most harmful effects of advertising to children were not the ads in and of themselves, though those can be incredibly harmful to kids and have fueled things like a childhood obesity epidemic. But the most harmful effect of advertising to kids is these environments that are built in order to advertise to kids. So things like social media is so harmful because it's designed in order to maximize things that advertisers want to see and not focused on children's well-being.
Right.
So we do a number of things. We advocate for policies like the Kids Online Safety Act and the update to COPPA that would make kids safer when they're online. We also advocate for policies, which COSA is one of them, that would help kids get the offline time that they need to thrive. These addictive platforms are a huge problem, as you know. And we don't just do policy work. We also do a lot of corporate campaigning. So, for instance, we led the campaign that stopped Meta from releasing an Instagram for young kids a couple of years ago. We do a lot of work at the Federal Trade Commission, filing complaints against companies that are violating children's privacy or engaged in unfair or deceptive practices. And in general, we believe that the issue of too much screen time, of harmful social media, are not things that parents can solve alone. And so we look for systemic solutions, whether it's policy, whether it's shaming corporations into doing the right thing, or whether it's our phone-free schools campaign that we'll be launching this summer. We think parents need help, that it's an unfair fight, and we're really focused on those big picture solutions.
Thank you, Josh. That is so helpful because parents have a hard time. We don't know what to do and how to make safe decisions around this. What brought you to Fairplay? What were you doing previously?
Sure. I was after I graduated from college and then went to grad school for a brief spell. I was working at Miramax Films for several years, and I think one of the sort of defining moments in my life was when we had the film Spy Kids. And everybody at Miramax was really excited because they cut a big deal with McDonald's, and a lot of the film took place in McDonald's. And I was the one sort of raising my hand saying, isn't anybody here concerned that we're using our quote unquote art to sell the worst kind of junk food to kids? And everybody looked back at me and said, what are you doing here? So I realized that it probably wasn't the right place for me. I went back to grad school, got a child development degree, and happened to read an article about this psychologist who was leading a protest outside of a convention where they were giving out awards for the best advertisement to children, and she thought that was obscene. And that was Susan Lin, and so I contacted her and said, I want to intern for you, and have been here ever since.
Amazing. I love that story. There's so much I want to talk about. I want to talk about social media, big tech. I want to talk about corporate campaigning, which you mentioned. I have some thoughts on that, but let's start with schools. So this is one of my favorite topics to kind of obsess over, like how we got to a point where kids are using so much tech in schools. Kids are bringing phones to schools and parents are insisting upon it. And I saw that Fairplay offers a Screens in Schools action kit, but I wonder what your thoughts are on how we're using tech in school settings generally.
Yeah, I think that schools are well-meaning, but they have been sold a bill of goods by the ed tech industry. I think one of the most insidious messages coming out of the ed tech industry is that technology can overcome structural inequalities, and so if we get more tech in poor schools, that will that will close the achievement gap that we see between low and high income students. When all the research says the opposite, that more tech actually leads to less academic achievement, that what makes a difference is things like small class sizes, having kids have the books and the offline things that they need in order to learn, to have that time to learn from each other, not to be, sitting there with their headphones and engaged at their screen, but actually working in a collaborative way. And so I think that the ed tech industry has done a really great job. Natasha Singer several years ago had an incredible series in the New York Times, which really looked at the way that the ed tech industry operates like the pharmaceutical industry, taking teachers on cruises, taking superintendents, giving them gifts and essentially bribing them. I think, and I think it's understandable, right? I mean, there's a natural inclination to think that more tech is better, that that equals progress. But I think it's one that we have enough evidence that it's not working in the schools. And it's not just the fact that kids don't learn as well when they're on screens all day. It's that, that also leads to things like their data being collected and used in ways that's not good for them. It leads to, mental health issues when they're on screens all day and not getting that face-to-face interaction with their peers that is so desperately needed. So I think, I hope right now there is so much focus, and rightly so, on social media. That is the biggest problem that our young people face. And, and as you know from so many of the guests you've interviewed, our kids are literally dying on social media. So I understand and part of that focus right now. But we need to recognize that the issues go deeper than social media, that it's really what this is about is that technology companies, whether they are ed tech companies or social media companies or video game companies, understand that it is very easy to make money off of children. It is very easy to make money off of addicting children. And we need to create a series of policies. We need to create a regulatory regime that says you need to look at children's well-being, that this cannot be all about your bottom line.
Yeah. And if we put the phones aside and we just talk about the screens being given to children and as young as kindergarten, is there any policy being created to back that up a little bit? Like parents, I'm hearing from a lot of parents that are like, I don't want my kindergartner using, an iPad all day. And then in my experience, they're going to start having to bring it home. And I want to opt out of that. And I'm being told that, no, your child's going to be behind if you opt out of having the device in your home. So are parents going to get any support around this?
I think we're in the early days on this. There have been a couple of states like Maryland and Louisiana that required schools to create policies around how much, but really those bills were watered down a lot from what their original intent was due to ed tech industry lobbying, So I am not aware of good sort of state policies that give parents the kind of help that they need in order to push back against some of this stuff. But I think we see a growing movement of parents who are really concerned. In our Screen Time Action Network, we have a very active Screens in Schools group, which is, produced the Screens in Schools Action Kit that you mentioned earlier, which is an incredible resource for parents or teachers who want to push back against ed tech. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming years, as these parents get more louder, and as parents. I think the pandemic was really eye-opening for a lot of parents in terms of they got to see firsthand just really how junky a lot of this ed tech is, that it really is sort of based around optimizing engagement and equating whether a kid is playing a game and wants to keep playing a game with learning. And that is not the outcomes we should be measuring. We've done a big campaign around this platform called Prodigy, which is all designed to, get kids hooked on playing this game where they want to buy stuff for their character. And if their parents don't pay for an expensive subscription, it makes it much harder to get the cool stuff in the game. And so you have kids playing this game in schools where some kids have access to all the cool stuff for their character and others don't. And it's like creating this new form of inequality. That's terrible. I mean,
Yeah.
that shouldn't be allowed. And so, we filed a complaint against that game at the Federal Trade Commission, and continue to look for ways to organize against that particular game. But in general, against this idea that gamifying education is going to lead to better outcomes for kids. It's just going to get kids even more hooked on games. It's not going to teach them the things we want them to learn.
Yeah. And I was just reading Susan's book about Who's Raising the Kids, but I read the chapter about Prodigy, the section about Prodigy. And so their website has research. Prodigy's website touts research from Johns Hopkins saying that increased use of their app is significantly correlated with increased achievement gains for students on standardized math assessments. But you guys looked into it. And when you look at the details of the study, a student would have to complete like almost 900 questions in the game in order to achieve a 1-point gain in their standardized assessment score. And the problem is the game isn't all about math. You earn points, you can purchase equipment and like pets. So you engage in so many activities that have nothing to do with math. So it's such a distraction. And this research is very misleading. So I appreciate you guys really digging into that. So there's like the failure of the ed tech apps to actually educate our children, but there's also the distractions on the school issued devices. So kids are getting on social media, kids are getting on other games, kids are getting on YouTube and NFL.com and watching football games during class. Like, so there's a big failure in my eyes around being able to lock down the devices in a way that keeps kids at least focused on what they feel the school feels to be educational. Do you feel like so I know there's a lot of lawsuits against social media companies coming from the school districts. Is that going to result in a blocking of social media on campuses, or is it just simply a funding play to try to get resources?
Yeah. So I think these, I can't speak to what the motivations are of the school lawsuits. I mean, I've talked to some of these school districts and I think they're genuine. I think they are really concerned about the impact that social media is having on the well-being of their students. And I think things like the number of disciplinary incidents that happen around social media. My brother-in-law is a high school principal, and the amount of time that he spends, cleaning up Meta and TikTok's mess is just outrageous, right? And that's taxpayer dollars going towards the externalities that are being caused by social media. Having said that, I do think, like we sent a letter to the Department of Ed a couple of years ago and asked them to issue guidance to schools that they shouldn't use social media with their own students.
Thank you.
And that just seems like such a no-brainer. Like if you're telling kids that if you want to be in the drama club, you have to be on Instagram because that's where we're going to be sending out announcements. That goes completely in the face of this idea that we want kids on Instagram less. And in fact, what you do is you take away the ability. It's hard enough right now to be a teenager and opt out from social media, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why we need systemic solutions, is because if I'm 15 and all my friends are on Instagram, I need to be on Instagram. Like, it's not really fair to ask me not to be on Instagram when my job as a 15-year-old is to be with my peers and separate from my parents. Like, that's my job as a teenager. So when schools are assigning things via social media, they're taking away what's already a really hard thing for a kid to do, which is to opt out, or a family to opt out, and saying that social media is mandatory. And so, yeah, I do think there's a real disconnect with this idea of suing social media companies and using social media in schools to communicate with students. I mean, I don't have a problem if schools like want to put things out to parents, like here's a clip from the basketball game last night. Like, that's different if it's parent facing. But once you start communicating to students via social media, I think that's a real issue.
I agree. And I hear from parents all the time who, maybe not specifically, I'm not hearing a lot in the school, a little bit, but it's mostly the sports teams associated with the school. A lot of that, the coaches require social media access. Okay, so we're establishing that, social media is causing issues at schools, and one solution is to ban phones, not have phones allowed during school hours. So what is happening around that? I know that technically 80+% of school districts in the US have phone bans, but there's a lot of problems with enforcement, leaving it up to the teachers to do like kind of one by one class by class enforcement. So is there any legislation focused around this? Like what's happening? And I'm all for phone bans in schools. So what can we hope for?
Yeah, so I think the anxious generation is
Mm-hmm.
really sort of turbocharging the phone-free schools
Yep.
movement, and so we're seeing a lot more schools who are, yes, they already had a policy, but who are implementing the policy. Sending letters to families saying that this is what we are going to do for the 24-25 school year. I
Mm-hmm.
was just at a meeting with the Massachusetts Attorney General's office that they hosted for a lot of schools in Massachusetts, and was really surprised to actually, and pleasantly surprised to hear about the
Mm-hmm.
number of Massachusetts districts, some of the really big districts, and some in places that you wouldn't necessarily suspect.
Mm.
Places like Brockton, which serve predominantly low income, first generation families, are
Mm-hmm.
going phone free next year. And so, I think
Wow.
there's sometimes a tendency to think about this as an issue for families who don't have anything else to worry about. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really great because all families and all schools need this.
Yeah.
It looks like the state of New York is going to introduce phone-free schools legislation next year. There was just a piece in the Guardian this morning about that. We're
Okay.
seeing other states that are interested in this. I think you're going to see you know, just a turbocharging of this, because what we're seeing is when schools do this, we're seeing, despite a lot of resistance, and don't get me wrong, a lot of resistance from both the
Mm-hmm.
students and unfortunately from the parents in some cases
Yep.
when you
Mm-hmm.
implement these policies. But what we're seeing is, after they have been placed for several months, we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
the parents are down with it, the teachers love it, the students
Mm-hmm.
come around to it.
Yep.
And I just, when you think about this, the numbers of kids being on their devices, basically every second they're awake and sleeping a lot
Mm-hmm.
less because of those devices, to give
Mm-hmm.
them a 6 hour break just seems like such a no brainer.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to see that. And I think the best thing that is going to happen on phone free schools is if, um, the more schools do this, it's just going to snowball, because when
Mm.
if my school district hears that the next town over is doing this and that the parents there are really happy with it, that's what's going to lead my school to do it. So I
Yeah.
really, if you have me back in 2 years, Nikki, I think we're going to see a tremendous difference in what's going
Okay.
on in schools.
Okay. And is the legislation providing funding for like yonder pouches or any actual way to lock up the phone so that they technically, it's not just banned, like they don't want to see it, they actually take it away?
Yeah, I'm not aware of legislation at this moment that provides for funding. I do agree with
Okay.
you that that is the best. First of all, students can't have them on their body at all, or they will look at them.
Mm-hmm.
Even putting
Mm-hmm.
them in their lockers
Mm-hmm.
is just too tempting. It leads to things like really long trips to the bathroom where
Yep.
you stop at your locker and then are in the bathroom for 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree that some kind of system for locking them up is the best, and ultimately, yes, I do think that's what we need to push for is for these. If they're going to do state legislation, for it to be funded, so that,
Okay. Right.
particularly for those schools that can't afford yonder patches, that they have the ability to purchase them, or some other solution like that.
Yeah. Okay. And some principals and school districts are just making it happen. I just interviewed a principal in West Texas, and she's going to implement Yonder next year. And Yonder's created a really nice like onboarding package for schools and all the resources. So it's don't work with them, but I think that they're a really good solution. Um, okay. So let's talk about social media specifically. I'll ask you straight up: is social media safe for kids?
No, it's not. It's not. I think when it comes to the way that it's designed, I mean, first of all, addiction is bad. And everything is
Mm-hmm.
designed for addiction. Everything is designed to take away young people's autonomy, to get them to act compulsively, to make
Mm-hmm.
them feel, if they are not instantly liking their friends' posts, that they
Mm-hmm.
are a bad friend. So that means they need to have their notifications on so they know when their friend has posted so they can instantly like that. Like literally, young people will tell you, if you don't like your friend's post, immediately, that means you're a bad friend. And that's like, how did
Mm-hmm.
we get to this point where, a relationships are being measured by metrics that social media companies want you to measure them by, instead of like what really makes a good friend. Like, that's a great question for a teenager, right?
Right.
What really makes a good friend? It's not instantly liking their posts and making sure that they know that you are available to them 24/7. It's actually
Yeah.
about being there when they need you, and in meaningful ways, not in sort of these useless gestures.
Hmm.
But obviously, it goes well beyond the addictive piece, and how it sort of changed kids and sense of self and their
Hmm.
relationships. You've talked to a number of parents whose kids have died because of fentanyl poisoning, and the way in
Hmm.
which these platforms make it easy for drug dealers to prey on young people is just
Hmm.
appalling, and it's preventable, and that's what's so frustrating about this. The same
Yeah.
thing with sextortion and sexual exploitation. I mean, are we really just going to shrug and say that it's fine that every week on Instagram, 1 out of 8 kids has an unwanted sexual advance, which we now know thanks to Arturo Bejar? Like,
Hmm.
that is just, when I hear that statistic, it's so horrifying and so infuriating. And
Hmm.
to act like, okay, well, kids need to be on social media, and this is just the price of being on social media, that you're going, that 1 out of 8 kids is going to be creeped on every week. That's just not okay. That's not
No.
okay. And then, the thing, the promotion of viral challenges, the choking
Hmm.
challenge. I mean, the fact that Joanne Bogard goes on these platforms every single week and re-traumatizes herself looking for the choking challenge, and it doesn't do a
Hmm.
thing. Like, that's just unacceptable, and that's not safe. Algorithms that send kids pro eating disorder content, or send kids content on how to cut themselves without their parents knowing about it. That's not safe
Hmm.
either. There's so
Right.
much that's not safe on social media. And what's really unfortunate is that most of it is preventable. Most of it, if we built social media differently, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be happening. But
Hmm.
ultimately, the things that will make social media safer will also lead kids to use it less often. And that's not okay with the platform. So they're not going to make these
Mm.
changes unless they're forced to.
Right. Okay. And that's the problem. And we have, when you talk about kids like having a new outlook on what a friend is. I mean, I feel like social media kind of bogarted the whole word friend. Like, an online connection is not a real friend. Like, friend doesn't mean friend anymore. And platforms like Snapchat offer even friend ranking systems where your friends are ranked 1 through 8 in different visuals, and even just ranking 1 through 8 with numbering. So it's just really harmful for teen anxiety and these teen relationships that they're supposed to be developing. And the platforms will say they're fighting sextortion, Meta recently, by blurring nude images in direct messages. But then you find out that, yes, they're blurred, but then you can just click on the image and see it anyways, which is almost like luring the teenager to look at it even more. So you summarized it really well, that they are going to act like they're going to fix it, but they're not going to, because can you touch on that? The nude image one with Meta really bothers me. Do you feel like if they just didn't allow nude images to be seen or sent, that would help things like sextortion?
Well, I mean, it's if you can identify them to the point that you're
Correct.
blurring them,
Yeah.
it really begs the question: why are you letting them through?
Yes.
And as you said, if anybody who knows anything about a teenage brain and impulsivity, the
Yeah.
idea to like, are you sure you want to kind of click on this because you're going to see the new nude image if you keep going?
Right.
I would wager 95% of teenagers are going to keep going. I mean, and it's the same
Hmm.
thing that we saw, on Instagram. You may, if click here if you want to see child pornography.
Listen.
Like, that story to me,
Shocking.
and thank God it came up at the hearing on January 31st,
Yep.
because that story to me was one of, like, I was like, okay, this is it. Like, when that story came out, I was like, Mark Zuckerberg's going to be out of a job tomorrow, because this is so outrageous. Like, click
Yeah.
here if you want to see CSAM. And yet that story barely made a blip. So I was really glad to see it come back up at the hearing. But like, all of these things that Meta has put in, it's like, oh yeah, we can identify it, but we're not going to do anything about it except put everything back on the user,
Hmm.
to self-police themselves. And again, like, the idea of putting a blurred nude image in front of a 15-year-old and saying, it's up to you now what's going to happen is just
Mm-hmm.
ridiculous.
Yeah, like there's right and wrong here, and unfortunately, we don't like work under the same laws, I guess. Like I don't know, some of these things are so shocking, and you do think like Mark Zuckerberg should be behind bars. Like I don't understand how we got here, but okay, so we've established, in your opinion, as social media is not safe for kids, but you sort of insinuated that kids like we kind of have to give it to them because otherwise they're ostracized or all their friends are on there. Like do we have to, if no legislation passes and it continues as it does now, would you, and are you, or would you let your kids use it? Because my kids are 8 and under, like they're going to get to a point where I have to make that decision, and if it stays as it is right now, it's a no for me.
I think it's a decision that every parent has to make for themselves, and
Yeah.
and I just want to be clear, it sucks. It is the most unfair decision that we have to make as parents, right? We
Mm-hmm.
have two terrible choices. We have allow our children to be on social media where all of their peers are,
Mm-hmm.
and then have to worry about things like fentanyl and dangerous viral challenges and sextortion and pro eating disorder content. And
Mm-hmm.
not to like, and that's just like the worst of the worst. And we also have to worry about, mental health issues and anxiety and depression that maybe don't rise to suicide, but are still incredibly serious and incredibly
Yeah.
damaging.
Yeah.
So that's one choice. The other choice is that we isolate our child from their peers, and that's damaging too, or can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hate that choice. I hate the fact that parents are put in that position, and it's completely unfair. And ultimately, what parents decide in that decision, I think, is
Mm-hmm.
going to be based on on knowing their own child and what's best for their child in that particular situation. Some children are better at sort of resisting peer pressure and that don't feel that pull in the same way. Like FOMO isn't
Mm-hmm.
as hard for them. I do think it's important to set limits if your kids are going to be on social media, or at least try to recognize that the
Mm-hmm.
companies are going to do everything they can to undermine your limits. But
Mm-hmm.
to me, it's an enormously personal choice. And for that, I can't blame somebody either way. And in fact, I want to get away. One of the great things about the last few years is social media used to be all about the parenting wars and like pointing fingers, like I'm a better parent than you because my kid's not on social media, or I'm a better parent than you because I relax and I don't worry about this stuff. And like
Mm-hmm.
we've moved beyond that. We've moved beyond that to the tech companies being the cause of these issues. And again, I watched an incredible TED talk by Gaia Bernstein last night, and she
Mm.
said, parents, if you're watching this, I don't want you to feel guilty. I want you to feel angry. And that's
Yeah.
where I
Right.
think we need to be. Like we need to relieve ourselves of this burden that there's a perfect way to parent around social media, because there isn't a
Mm-hmm.
perfect way to parent around social media, because we have been dealt a really unfair deck of cards, and so we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do the best with the hand that we dealt. And ultimately, that's why Fair Play focuses on these systemic solutions, is because we need to get rid of this
Yeah.
unfair dilemma that parents are in, and make a world that's safe for all kids.
Yeah. Okay. And I want to talk about legislation, but I do feel like when parents are having to make this decision, do you feel like they have all the information? Like, I don't feel like when I, tell stories of harm or give statistics, a lot of parents will think, well, that's, one off. That's not going to happen to my child. So if we armed parents with more information, do you think we would see a societal shift in just restricting social media access because most parents realize it's so unsafe and harmful?
I think it would certainly help, and I think
Yeah.
you've had a number of the same parents that we work with
Hmm.
on, and honestly, I've heard their stories so many times, and they get to me every single time. On
Hmm.
they're no less powerful on the 50th listen than the first,
Yeah.
and I do think like being in the room with those parents is life changing for people, and I
Yeah.
think they will never think about social media again if they hear those parents. Having said that, it is really, really hard to change behaviors, particularly when you're talking about addictive technologies or addictive substances without policy changes. I mean, if you look at like tobacco, which I think is a really instructive movement to look to, you know, it took attorneys general states suing the tobacco companies. It took class action lawsuits. It took laws that changed environments so you couldn't just light up in your office anymore or in the movie theater or on an airplane, which is similar to what we're trying to do with phone-free schools. You know, yes, it took changes in norms around smoking, and we need to change the norms around social media, but I don't think we would have changed the norms without all the other pieces in place. And so I think these things need to happen in concert. And I guess I appreciate the question because that's where the parents are living now, right? They're living in that moment now. What do I do in this second? I can't wait for Congress. I can't wait for the attorney general lawsuits. I need to make a decision today. So I appreciate that that's the real sort of struggle that parents are facing. But having said that, you know, I love Jonathan's book. I think he calls for the right things. I think he underestimates the difficulty in changing parenting norms. We're all so busy. I mean, and also like even doing some of the collaborative stuff. It's really, really hard. We did it with my daughter. We did the wait until eighth pledge when she was in kindergarten. We were like, we're going to get an early start on this. We did it with all the parents of the kids that she was friends with in in kindergarten and first grade. She got to seventh grade. She wasn't friends with any of those kids anymore. And all the kids that she was friends with now had phones. And so, you know, and we took the time. We had the meetings. We did the pledge. We gave things to other parents to read. This is my job, right? So I have it probably easier than anybody else. And it was still a real struggle. So I guess I guess, you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with those efforts. I think people should do them to their capability and to the time that they have in order to try those things. I just, for me, I worry if we put too much of the emphasis back on that and not on changing the platforms, that ultimately at the end of the day, kids are still going to be on these platforms and they're not going to be changed. And so that's where we focus the majority of our efforts.
Okay. Yeah, I understand that. And I think, you know, societal change has to start with the parents' behavior too. And parents are just not willing to put that phone down. I mean, and
we're addicted.
So I know
we're all addicted. And I think that's like, we need to acknowledge that. That's like the first step, right? Is, you know, I mean, if you look at any addiction, right? The first step is admitting your powerlessness. And I think it's hard. It's hard to admit that we're all, I mean, we sort of do it jokingly, but it's not a joke.
Right.
As adults, we are all, everybody, the only person I don't know who's not addicted to their smartphone is my father because he doesn't have one.
Yeah. And it's hard to break that. Like when I go into a coffee shop, I leave my phone in the car. When my kids are home, my husband and I leave our phones in our bedroom. Like we really have to try so hard, just these little things to try to remove the phone from being the priority over our relationships with our kids. And it's hard. So, you know, I have a family friend who's in a book club with a bunch of moms. And I said, you guys should read The Anxious Generation. And she goes, no, these moms would not want to highlight any of that, like, and make any changes in their behavior. And I just thought that was kind of depressing. But when you talk about addiction, and then we'll get to legislation, but so we are really feeding and creating addictive behaviors in children by giving them the phone, social media access at a young age. Is there any research that like when you create addictive tendencies in children, will they tend to have more addiction in adulthood to other substances and things like that? Is there a link to that? Or are we not really?
That's a great question. If there's research on that, I'm not familiar with it. I think there's so many things that I want us to study, including like, you know, I think there was a lot of research around television that if you delayed TV watching with kids, that they watched less TV as adults. And in fact, like people who grow up in TV-free families, like they would go on like a little binge once they got out of their household, and then they would go back down. I'm curious whether that's going to end up being true with phones. Like we're so early that we don't have that long-term longitudinal research. And I genuinely don't know. Like, are these things so addictive that even if you delay getting them that, and then you get one when you're 17 instead of when you're 10. Are you less addicted? I don't know. I think that's a really great question. There's a number of questions that I think we need to understand the science of how kids are addicted to their phones and what it means better.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I need to get back on with a neuroscientist again and talk about how dulling those dopamine receptors in like young teen years, if we just wait a few years, is that helpful? And how will that affect them into adulthood with their adult behaviors? Anyway, well, let's dig into that together at some point.
That sounds good. Yeah, and if I could just say one other thing, I think one of the things that I think sometimes gets lost in these conversations, including what I just did just now, is like we think about future outcomes in terms of delaying phones and things like that. It's really, really important for the now too, right? To have that kind of childhood that Jonathan Haidt is talking about, that or Lenore Skenazy, that outdoor free play based childhood. There are benefits in the now that are so important that we lose out on when we give our kids phones. So even while we're waiting for some of that longer term research, we should be doing these things because, we're not giving your kid a great childhood is not just so they have make more money as an adult. It's because those childhood is, a quarter of their life or a fifth of their life. And we should be doing everything to maximize their well-being and happiness during those years, not just for the future outcomes.
Yeah. And I've learned through talking with a lot of parents, there's such a spectrum of how screens are treated in each household. And I think every parent can just shift their decisions, shift their approach a little bit, like make little changes in the benefit of the play-based childhood and restricting screens a little bit more. It doesn't have to be drastic, but I think there can be positive small changes as well. But getting higher level out of the parents' decisions, what is our federal government doing to fix this? What are people working on legislation focused on? I know that there's been some state legislation, but I think what I've learned is it's important that we have some federal laws passed to sort of create a standard. So what should parents be thinking about regarding federal legislation?
Well, Fairplay is, and so many advocates right now are really focused on getting the Kids Online Safety Act passed. That bill would create a duty of care for social media and online platforms to prevent the worst types of harms that occur on these platforms, including social media addiction. So it really, right now, what we see, and we see this time and time again, and like looking at the attorney general lawsuits against Meta is really instructive. Like, even when high-level people at those companies are raising concerns about the way that Instagram is designed for young people, they are just getting shut down by Mark Zuckerberg and others who are saying, no, we're not going to do that. And so creating a duty of care so that the legal people within those companies can be armed to say, listen, if we don't do this, if we go ahead with this feature, which maybe will keep kids scrolling more, but also is harming them in X, Y, and Z ways, we are going to be in hot water. That will empower a lot of changes at those companies. So there's other things that the Kids Online Safety Act does, but that duty of care to me is really kind of the key. That bill, as I think has 70 co-sponsors in the Senate. We have the commitment of Senate Majority Leader Schumer that he's going to bring the bill to the floor. We just advanced out of subcommittee in the House last week. We think we have a better chance of passing legislation this year, federal legislation, than we have had in 25 years, and we need to get this done. So that's really our focus. In concert with COSA, we're also focused on the update to the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act, which would give teens privacy rights for the first time, would ban data-driven advertising to minors, which is really important because all of this stuff is about making money off of them. And so disrupting that business model is super important. And then the other thing, which people probably don't know, but it would also change what's called the knowledge standard for social media companies. So right now, the one law that we have that protects kids says that you can't collect data from a child under the age of 13 without getting parental permission, which is the reason why the companies all say you have to be 13 have a social media account. But the problem is that law is written in such a way that it really incentivizes the companies to pretend that they don't know that those under 13s are on there. And so this update to COPPA would change that and say, if you should know, you're responsible for knowing, and it would just really provide a huge amount of ammunition to get the 10, 11, and 12-year-olds, 9-year-olds off of social media, because the companies would be liable for collecting their data.
Okay, yeah, because these companies, they'll like internally re-age people. So kids say they're 13 or 16, but if they're really 10 and the company knows that based off of their interactions or even them writing I'm 10, then the company is targeting them based on their young age, where we need that to be publicly available, right? And if they're 10, they need to be removed from the platform.
Exactly. If they're 10, they need to be removed from the platform. And the other thing that happens is that, if you sign up when you're 10 and you say that you're 13, then by the time you're 15, the platform is treating you as if you're 18. So you're not getting any of those safety options for a teenager. And you're absolutely right. We know that these platforms are, the age that we enter at sign up is just one data point. They have billions of data points on kids. And so when kids are putting fourth grade hashtags or wishing somebody a happy 10th birthday, that is a pretty good indication that the age they entered is not their true age. And they use that information in order to target kids, target ads to them, target content to them. So they should also be using that to enforce kicking under 13s off of the platform and providing safety protections for 13s through 17s.
Right. Okay. So I'm interested to know, if KOSA passes, what will parents see? What differences will parents see in our homes regarding our kids and what they're accessing on their phones or devices?
It won't be instantaneous. We should be realistic about that. It will probably, the companies will announce some new things almost certainly when it passes, and then we will need some good enforcement actions from the Federal Trade Commission to be clear that this law is going to be enforced, and then we will see more and more changes. But I think, what I think we will see is a much better effort at preventing the algorithms that send kids down these rabbit holes of really the worst content. I think we will see that content not being pushed to kids in the same way. And that's, it doesn't mean that there won't be the existence of that content on these social media platforms, but it's the pushing of it that's so concerning and disturbing. So kids who are not looking for how do I kill myself are getting instructions on how to kill themselves, and that's really, really concerning. So that'll be a big thing. I think they have in the duty of care, they have to prevent against social media addiction, and so I think some of these things like I'm very hopeful, and that'll part of be Fairplay's job is to make a case that things like infinite scroll and autoplay are violating the duty of care, and that these features need to be off for young people. So those are things that I think we'll see. And then a lot of the safety stuff. And so, when you think about features like snap maps, and things that allow drug dealers or other predators to connect easier with kids, and Snap loves it because it drives a lot of engagement. I think those things like that are things that would be very likely to disappear under KOSA. So really, some of the most insidious features and things that the algorithms are doing are the places that I think we'll see the most immediate impact.
Okay, and we can expect that to affect the revenue of some of these companies. Should we maybe expect some of these companies to go away? I'd be happy to see that.
I don't think we'll see these companies go away, unfortunately. Okay. I wouldn't mind if they went away. I mean, they're making, here's the thing. These companies are so profitable. Right. They don't need to make $11 billion a year off of young people in order to be profitable. They're already enormously profitable. And in fact, part of what they're getting from young people is not just the money that they're advertising revenue that year, but they're getting lifetime loyalty by, reaching kids. So unfortunately, I think they'll still, unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, I think they'll still be profitable and they won't go away. But to me, that just drives home the sheer greed involved. Like, right, if you're already um, some of the most powerful and profitable companies in the world with,
Yeah.
even if you remove the addicting kids piece of the equation, like why do you
Mm-hmm.
need to addict kids on top of that? And so I think,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where we'll see the biggest differences. Unfortunately, I think Snap and TikTok and Instagram will probably still be with us.
Okay. And how can parents, well, talk about how important it is that parents speak up in support of these bills.
It is enormously important. If you go to fairplayforkids.org, we make it easy for you to contact your legislators
Okay.
and tell them that you support COSA. We have been subject to an enormous disinformation campaign around this bill the
Mm-hmm.
past 2 years, and because groups that are literally 500 times the size of Fair Play, like the ACLU, are opposed to the Kids Online Safety Act, and are able to drive large numbers of people to these offices and oppose these bills. It's
Mm-hmm.
enormously important that parents and people who care about children contact their legislators and say that this is important to me. This is a bill that has incredible bipartisan support. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't break down among normal party lines. But we know, that we're trying to regulate one of, if not the most powerful industry in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And their lobbyists are in there every day, and the groups that they fund are spreading disinformation about COSA
Mm-hmm.
every single day. So it is enormously important that people speak up and tell their reps and senators that this is in fact what we do want.
Okay, and I'll include links in the episode notes on how parents can do that. And I just have a clarification when we talk about how big tech is spending millions of dollars lobbying against these bills. What does that mean? They have actual humans going into the elected officials' offices and convincing them that this will, break the internet or something, or are they paying? Are they funding their campaigns? Like, what does that actually mean? How are they
Um,
putting the pressure on?
So it's a combination of things.
Okay.
They have their own lobbyists who are going in every day and talking directly to key offices about this bill and why they shouldn't support it. They
Okay.
fund trade associations and other groups who are doing the same thing. And
Okay.
there is the direct contributions to campaigns.
Is that allowed?
What's that?
Is that
Well,
allowed?
well, they can do it through their trade associations. They can do it through, yes,
Okay.
it is allowed. It is allowed, unfortunately. There are limits to how much they can do.
Mm,
If almost everybody in DC is taking money from the tech industry, and that's a real problem.
okay. I was debating this with my husband a few days ago, and I was like, "There's no way they can take money from big tech," and like I don't understand. That's not right. But there's a lot of things I've learned, right versus wrong. Like it doesn't matter.
Yeah, no,
you
and
know.
and our legal system and our electoral system is set up to give corporations a tremendous amount of rights that I think, including free speech rights and the right to donate to campaigns, which
Mm,
probably need some fixing. But I'm
okay.
going to stick to social media.
Yeah. 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 Me too. Okay. Anything else? Anything else that we didn't cover that's important to share with parents who are listening?
I think we covered a ton. I would just
Yeah.
say, I really, really, I guess the only thing I would say is for parents to not blame themselves, for parents
Yep.
to try and recognize the struggles that you're having are being had by just about every parent who has
Hmm.
kids of these ages. That to recognize that you have been put in a terrible position, which is, you know, do I allow my kids to go on these places where which are unsafe for kids, or do I
Hmm.
isolate them from their peers? And to get angry about that choice, to get angry
Yeah.
and to get active.
Yep.
This isn't going to change unless we get organized, unless we continue to grow this movement. And for me, what's so exciting about this moment is, a few years ago, we didn't have your podcast, Nikki. We didn't
Mm.
have the parents, the survivor parents speaking out and demanding change in Washington. We didn't have so many of the organizations. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years. It was pretty lonely
Hmm.
work for a long time.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
now we are seeing a tremendous movement building to fight back against big tech. And that's what it's going to take, because it's not enough to be right. We are 100% right, but they have more power. And so we need to change that piece of it. And the way we do that is by getting mad and getting organized.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you to all your team at Fairplay for being like the voice for our children. And we parents are mad, and we want to have our voices heard too. So these conversations are really important. And I just thank your team. Parents can go to fairplayforkids.org and find all the information there. But thank you again for supporting parents in our effort to raise our kids in this like screen obsessed culture, and for the kindness that in just the relating. I think it's important for parents to know, like, this is hard. We can acknowledge that, but let's use our voices to fight back. So thank you again, Josh, for being here. I really appreciate you.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and thanks for all you do. It's just wonderful to see this platform giving voice to so many people who are fighting for change.
Thank you, Josh.